Dear Guntram, Wolff, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, first, my apologies for being a bit late, but I had an appointment with Minister Schauble, which lasted a bit longer than not hoped, but expected. It is my pleasure to join you today for this discussion, and I would like to extend my warmest thanks to Bruegel for inviting me to this high-level conference. Growth and stability, both are crucial, both are actively pursued, and both have been somewhat elusive this year. The good news is revitalizing them is within our reach today. To do so, we must view the two major crises that hit Europe in 2015, not merely as crisis, but also as opportunities. The Greek crisis, in my view, is an opportunity to remedy the blatant shortcomings in our economic and monetary governance, and the refugee crisis is also an opportunity to raise potential growth and to promote much-needed structural reform. These are the 2 points I will launch to introduce our discussion. First, the Greek crisis. We have learned from the Greek crisis that we need to fix the governance of the Economic and Monetary Union. Let's go back in time for a moment. What did it take to reach an agreement on Greece in the Eurogroup? Almost 20 acrimonious and inconclusive meetings over the course of 10 months, a record, but a record of which we should not be proud. One national referendum, several votes in national parliaments, including, of course, the German Bundestag, and one big, massive drama of a European Council in the summer. How did we end up in such a dire situation? Well, to paraphrase Clinton's famous tagline, it's the institutions, stupid. There is a clear understanding today that the Greek crisis revealed serious failures in our governance. More importantly, this understanding is now shared. It is shared across the political spectrum, and it is shared by heads of state and governments. We have been experiencing these failures for years now, but it took the Greek crisis for our leaders to come to realize that change was needed. And I'm not talking about cosmetic change or change in 10 years' time. I'm talking about important changes and changes now or in the months and years to come. This shared understanding has provided a fresh political impetus to the reform of the governance of the EMU. As you know, a report has been prepared by the 5 presidents of EU institutions. It was released in June. I hope we will have a chance to discuss some of its recommendations in a few minutes. Several governments came up before the summer with their own set of proposals, including the French and German governments. Obviously, they did not go unnoticed. The European Parliament is also weighing in, if only because it was utterly frustrated by its somehow marginal role in the run-up to agreement with the Greek government. These are useful contributions we can draw from to fix the EU governance. But what exactly needs to be fixed? In my opinion, our governance of the EMU failed on 3 fronts. First, democratic oversight. It is a subject that is dear to the hearts of German citizens. It is to mine too. As it happens, no role has been foreseen for the European Parliament in the European Stability Mechanism, which is, at the time being, let's say, merely intergovernmental. We will partly remedy this shortcoming in the implementation stage, but the Parliament feels that the Eurogroup too often works as a kind of a black box, and that this body takes major decisions, which is true, without proper involvement of European representatives, which is also true. Second failure, I would say the lack of identification or the lack of personification. Do we need a euro area tsar, just like we have a kind of external relations star? Let's put it this way. Personification is, in my view, a prerequisite for accountability, and vice versa. No personification leads to dilution of responsibilities. In other words, personification would be a useful first step toward empowering MEPs to give the boot to someone directly accountable to them. So we need to have a Mr. or Mrs. Euro, to make it simple. Third, existing arrangements do not cater for the expression of the European general interest, and that's probably the main problem. So let me expand on this a little bit. From January to August, the Eurogroup operated as a platform for head-on confrontations between opposite sources of legitimacy. It was a given for all governments around the table that Greece should respect the commitments made by Athens under previous leaderships. But Mr. Tsipras' government objected to this premise because Syriza's campaign platform in January this year departed significantly from these very commitments. So there is a kind of conflict between an institutional legitimacy. When you're in government, you represent a state, not only a political opinion, and it was pitted directly against political legitimacy. You take your legitimacy from the voters, and if the voters say you've got to do something absolutely different or absolutely new, then you take another source of legitimacy which can be opposed to the previous one. In addition, the legitimacy of the Greek government and of the Greeks' vote in the referendum, organized in July, was pitted directly against the legitimacy of other European governments. I participated to those almost 20 Eurogroups, and it's clear that in the press, in the media, some people talked about you must listen to the Greek people. But the Greek voters are not all the voters in Europe. The Greek public opinion is not the only public opinion in Europe. And the 18 other member states' public opinion and public voters are as legitimate as the Greek voters and public opinion. Yes, the Greek government is accountable to its people, but so are the other 18 governments in the euro area. We Europeans failed to solve this conflict of legitimacies in a timely and orderly fashion because we do not have the right governance to allow for the expression of European general interest. As Habermas pointed out, European governments are unable to act in the interest of a joint European community because they think mainly of their national electorate. We are stuck in a political trap. In other words, the sum total of conflicting national interest does not add up to the European general interest. I would even say we need to define the euro area interest. The Commission attends the meeting of the Eurogroup, but it is not firmly part of the decision-making process. It is not the commentary method there, contrary to the ECOFIN or, for example, the Environment or Justice Council. This is not a sound basis to handle future crises of similar nature. It is not a sound basis for the European project. If the euro area, which is the very core of the European Union, is struggling so much, how can it possibly create political momentum and act as a driving force to the rest of member states? And it is certainly not a strong basis to foster growth and stability, and then we come back to the very beginning of our discussion. My personal take is that a very far-reaching reform of the EMU governance is needed, and it is needed sooner rather than later. it is needed faster than slower. It is needed stronger than weaker. This reform should remedy the three shortcomings I just mentioned a minute ago. I believe, to come into proposals, that the executive role of the European Commission should be dramatically enhanced in the Eurogroup, and that the Commission should be represented by a Eurozone finance minister, or to say it another way, that the Eurozone must be represented by a minister which should be a member of the Commission. The Eurozone finance minister would be in the front line to handle crises on behalf of the euro area community, and he or she should be able in due time to draw on financial resources available for the euro area. Let's call that a financial capacity, or if you want it differently and simply, a budget. This will not come as a surprise or as a shock to many of you. I am a long-time supporter of this governance shift. And my experience with the Greek crisis has only reinforced my personal conviction on the matter. I precise, for those who would have doubts, that I'm not running for this job, but it would seem strange that I defended that when a member of the Council, as Finance Minister, and now a Commissioner, I would have a different view. I've got exactly the same. You can read the papers delivered by the French Treasury almost 3 years ago. However, a Eurozone finance minister will only be able to speak on behalf of the euro area if he or she again is backed by democratic legitimacy. It would be up to the European Parliament to consider this issue and decide for itself how it may best organize its proceedings and internal arrangements to confer legitimacy upon the minister and to exercise democratic control over him or she in the future. Make no mistake, I measure very well how challenging it is for Germany, including on a constitutional level, to envisage shifting control over any executive powers to another body than the Bundestag. And I measure that the European Parliament, as it stands now, it might not be the perfect candidate for such a shift. As you know, any German member of Parliament, and I discuss that often with Wolfgang, is elected by 200 to 300,000 larger German citizens, and in the European Parliament, the bracket is more than 3 times larger. It takes from 17 to 700,000 citizens to elect an MEP. Can we consider that it is legitimate enough? That's a debate that you may have here. I've been twice a member of the European Parliament, once as a vice president, and I never considered that the German representation was weak. If you look at the positions, the influence of Germany inside this parliament, well, this can be balanced or discussed. Some say exactly the contrary, to be very frank. So we have to be very lucid on the challenge. On some very specific issues, we will need more executive power at the center and more democratic control of better quality. This is my first ideas about governance of EMU. I turn now to the other crisis that could also morph into an opportunity to foster growth and stability, the refugee crisis. At first glance, and for, I would say, our citizens, which express concern about that, the refugee crisis may be seen as a risk. Let's be clear, for a lot of our citizens, or fellow citizens, it is seen as a threat. This perception should not obliterate the economic benefits that may be reaped from a sudden inflow of population. Europe, we all know that, and you know that in this country, is an aging continent. Rapid population aging has adverse effects on labor supply and potential growth. Germany, by far the largest economy in Europe, is an aging country. What do aging countries do? They worry about their shrinking workforce. which they rightly see as a risk for the financial sustainability of their own pension system. This is perfectly natural. So they prepare for the future. They run current account surpluses. They implement extra careful fiscal policies. They accumulate large amounts of private savings. These forces are deflationary, if you look at the economy in nature. Any alleviating factor is good for growth, good for convergence. It would be short-sighted in this context to consider refugees and migrants in general exclusively as a burden to be borne and not as a resource. Up to a certain point, aging countries can implement measures to bring more nationals to the job market, such as spurring female labour force participation by stepping up the provision of high-quality childcare services. But there is only so much a country can do to boost its employment rate. A large inflow of migrants can actually prove useful to alleviate some of the pressure. Migrants are also, or can be, if they are allowed to, a highly mobile form of labour. In a European job market that is still largely divided along national lines, they will seek to settle where they have the best prospects. Hence Germany's strong appeal, while other countries who feel invaded have a much lower appeal, and you can imagine which country am I talking about, for example. We are currently trying to deepen the monetary union, inter alia to put in place stabilisation mechanisms in the face of asymmetric shocks. The capital market union, the finalisation of the banking union are such mechanisms. A fiscal capacity of one sort or another could also serve the goal, and there is a linkage between the 2 points I'm mentioning tonight. But enhanced labour mobility is also such a mechanism. That is not to say that member states should wait passively to reap the economic benefits of the refugee crisis. These benefits are, I'm convinced, within reach, but they are not unconditional. The key is to view integration policies targeted at refugees as an investment. What can we expect in terms of impact on growth? To put it in the broadest possible terms, we're working on that at the Commission level. In the short term, processing a vast amount of asylum seekers will of course have a budgetary impact, which will vary greatly from one member state to another. As you may know, some member states have asked the European Commission to examine whether the refugee crisis could be considered from a budgetary point of view as falling under the exceptional circumstances provision of our fiscal rules, mainly Austria and Italy. This important issue is being considered, but in accordance with the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact, which are the basis. No decision has been taken yet. In the mid to long run, positive economic effects may be expected, subject to rapid access to the job market. To the extent that work permits are handed out, immigration leads to an expansion of the workforce, and this additional labour supply will increase potential GDP. This is not a far-fetched objective. Let's take, again, the example of Germany, being in Berlin. Asylum seekers are asked on a voluntary basis about their education and occupational skills during the application procedure. A recent study highlighted that the Syrian refugees were on average better educated than other asylum seekers. 21% of the Syrian asylum seekers who came to Germany between the beginning of 2013 and September 2014 said that they had attended university against an average of 15%. Again, let me reiterate my point. Early intervention is crucial. Studies from the OECD point out that early and intensive efforts are required to provide language training, assess individual skills, provide school access, address health and social problems, and work with employees to help boost refugees' chances of employment. In the past, it took as much as 15 years to reach a 70% employment rate for refugees. So it's about public policies there. One aspect should be carefully examined by policymakers, the impact on wages, as well as a distributional impact on indigenous or national workers. This impact will depend on the extent to which migrant skills compete with or complement the skills of national workers. The economic literature describes positive distributional effects on workers whose skills are complemented by the immigrant workforce. Then again, it's about public policy. The refugee crisis may also act as a catalyst for much-needed reforms on the market and goods services. Let's imagine a minute a Syrian doctor settling in one of the countries in the area. He or she will probably have to take active steps for the recognition of its credentials, which he or she may or may not get. If he or she does not get it, which would be a missed opportunity for the host country because we lack doctors in our countries, he or she may seek to take a job as, let's say, taxi driver. Here, he or she may be faced with yet another difficulty, which is that taxis are a regulated position in a number of countries, and this could be a wasted opportunity. Again, it's about public policy. You see where I'm going with this. The refugee crisis is going to cast a sharp light on remaining cross-border barriers. It might just provide us with the perfect opportunity to tackle these barriers, should they be unwarranted, and to promote growth-enhancing structural reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests, I'm not delusional. I am perfectly aware that many European citizens have no time for sophisticated considerations on EU governance, and that they have no or little appetite for integration policies targeted at refugees in a context of high unemployment. Yet, as unappealing as these discussions may be, in my view, they are crucial to underpin growth and stability, in particular in the euro area. What is needed now is a large measure of political will, not to say political courage, but in fact I think we need both to bring the matter to the European public space, and this is what the few remarks I just presented you are about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for these very rich remarks about not just governance, but also really the refugee crisis and what the refugee crisis means in terms of opportunity, but also, of course, in terms of challenge to the public policy system. Now, I think in your remarks, you have very much emphasized on the governance side, of course, three important points. One is the democratic oversight, one, the lack of identification, and finally, the question of who actually defines and thinks about the European general interest. Now, I was a bit surprised, I have to say, that you, in your speech, you used so much the Greek crisis as a starting point for that discussion. I mean, obviously we've lived through this very difficult Greek crisis, and that has been a huge burden on our policy system. But it seems to me that the justification for such reforms goes far beyond the Greek crisis and issues such as the Greek issue. I mean, in this town, I would say many people would probably think that the Greek issue is rather idiosyncratic. So we have a specific country, which is called Greece, that has serious troubles, some for its own making, some for public policy failures in the Troika and so on. Some argue that there were all the problems with the Troika, with unclear accountability and so on. Nobody really knows who took which decision in a setup with three different institutions. But still, it's a very specific case. It's Greece. Now, your argument goes much further. It basically says we need a Eurozone finance minister who has the legitimacy to take decisions and overrule also some national decisions. So perhaps you can enlarge a bit more on the justification beyond the Greek issue.
You're absolutely right, and I share this view. As I said, as a finance minister for France, since 2012, I advocated for the same ideas. To sum up, first, we need a Eurozone finance minister. Second, we need a financial capacity, saying that we need to examine and discuss what's the use of that capacity. Is it only for stabilization? Is it for redistribution? Is it for allocation of resources? We also will need to discuss about what could be the resources, own resources or other resources for such a budget. Also advocated in favor of a treasury for the euro area, which of course is where this budget goes, and for a parliament of the eurozone, which has to be inside the European Parliament. I don't believe that national parliaments should be involved in that. There are debates about that, but I've been in my political life a member of the Council for 7 years, a member of the European Parliament for 6 years. Now I'm a member of the Commission, and I've been a member of national parliament for 20 years. And I know what's the business of a national MP is defending national and sovereign interests. So sociologically, I would say, and politically and psychologically, this should not be mixed up. So these are proposals, I think, that are important. Why did I took the Greek case to enter into that field? It is because the Greek case is so topic of what doesn't work that for the first time, it came in the public debate. Everybody knows in Europe what the Greek case is. Everybody knows about our discussions. The medias were never so interested about Eurogroup, members of Eurogroup, commissioners. They know who we are now, not in the best way, but they know who we are. And I think also that the fact that this case was not solved by the Eurogroup, but had to be resolved finally, even if prepared at 90% by the Eurogroup, by the European Council, also was for the leaders in Europe a clear conscience that something had to be done now. So Greece is not the cause why we need to reform the governance of the EMU, but Greece might be the creative shock that will lead us now to speed up and not to have only academic discussions about that, or proposal from this or that minister or this or that government. And this is why we know with Greece that we absolutely need to implement the 5 President report, plus or less, phase 1 and or phase 2. And my view there is that, of course, we need to start with phase 1. That's what we call in French la palissade. Phase 1 is before phase 2. But we must not lose sight of phase 2. We must first act on phase 1, and that's what the Commission is preparing now for this quarter of this year, the last quarter of 2015. But we must also have the public debate about phase 2, because phase 1 is about, I would say, convergence, it's about discipline, and phase 2 is about solidarity and democratic accountability. And obviously, what people and governments can expect from the reform of the EMU governance is mostly about democratic accountability.
perhaps before opening up, let me ask you one more question, which goes to the issue of governance in a European Union that has several different currencies. I mean, we like it or not, but we do have several different currencies. And certainly the things you just discussed are really done issues for the Eurozone. I mean, it's a clear Eurozone agenda. Now, I think it's fair to say that probably in this town, many people, much more people are worried about the prospects of Brexit, so the UK leaving the EU than Greece leaving the Eurozone. So I guess my question for you is, I mean, these Eurozone institutions that you have thought of, and you gave the Commission a prominent place in it, to what extent is their governance really a problem? Could it become a problem for the non-Eurozone countries? And should it really be in the Commission, or should we perhaps think about solutions where the single market logic is pursued by one institution, so the UK and other countries have another approach to European governance, while the Eurozone creates its own kind of institutions that deepen the cooperation within the Eurozone?
First, why is the Greek case so important? We are talking about a small economy representing 2% of the GDP of the euro area. And we are talking about a country in which reforms have not been made in the 20 years in the past, if they have been done ever. A huge democracy, a huge history, but a poor state. That's what Greece is about. So some could wonder, why insisting so much on fighting against Brexit? In my view, for a very simple and matter of principle reason. What is Euro about? Euro is about integrity and about irreversibility. If one country leaves the Euro, then we are no more in a single currency. We are in a fixed rate, exchange rate. And the monetary history proves that this kind of zone always died. That's what Mario Draghi once argued in the Eurogroup, and I share this view. And it was so important for the even existence and for the importance of Euro that we had to avoid Brexit. Of course, not at any condition. We had the discussion in the Eurogroup. The German position was, as everybody knows, very strong. But again, I always understood Wolfgang Schäuble's position as we want Greece in the Eurozone, but there needs to be very strong reforms now, and the program must be really conditional. And that's always the discussions I had with him since the beginning of this year, when Syriza won the elections in Greece with a different conception than Syriza today, of course. Brexit. Of course, the departure from Great Britain from the EU would be a terrible shock. And the position of the Commission is very clear. We want Great Britain to stay in the EU. We believe it's both the interest of the British people, the British economy, and the rest of Europe and our own economy. And so that's with this spirit that we are going to discuss with the British government. And I believe it is clear that Mr. Cameron and his government also want Great Britain to stay in the European Union, and that they are convinced that the future of Great Britain is in the European Union. Then we'll have to discuss, maybe to negotiate. One brief remark first. We don't know exactly what the British government wants. The discussion has not started, or has just started on a list of matters. And of course, it will have to be more precise than today. We cannot discuss that vaguely. A second remark about that is that we must do everything that is necessary to keep Great Britain in without contradiction with the main core values or principle of the European Union. That also means that for the British government, it's not simple to negotiate. They need to ask from their partners things that are reasonable enough so that they can be accepted, but they are strong enough so that the British people feel that there has been a game changer there. And in that context, of course, the relationship between the in, the euro, and the out will be on the table. I think that might be one of the issues on which, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it could be easier to find solutions because we're used to that. We already have that kind of relationship. As you know, the Eurogroup exists, meets on Monday, then the ECOFIN meets on Tuesday. And on matters such as banking union, I must say that the difficulties were maybe higher inside the Eurogroup than within the Eurozone countries and the outs. We can, I think, find pragmatic arrangement on that. But it is not a reason, because there is this referendum, because we need to combine the in and the outs to avoid progress in the euro area governance and then to have specific also ways of governance. I think that the Commission is capable of being on both sides, defending the general interest of Europe and also being at the core of the general interest of the euro area. I will take an example, the external representation of the Eurozone. Today the Commission represents Europe in the IMF. I will be next week in Lima for that. I think it can also represent the interest of the Eurozone. But I know that it is a debate that we'll have to lead. What I would like to avoid is a kind of regression in which intergovernmental body should be given the task to express European general interest, and I don't believe that they can.
No, I think we would probably agree on the point that intergovernmental bodies have a very hard time expressing a common interest because, after all, as you, I think, very strongly pointed out, these are national representatives and they have national mandates, and so that's
so
what
what can we invent which is not intergovernmental and which is not the Commission?
Right. Let me open for question and remarks. Eric has one. Eric Nielsen from UniCredit.
Thanks for that. I wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit on your vision of when you have addressed your three key issues and the institutional setup. I don't want to sort of put it too specifically, but in the case of Greece, how do one get to a place where would that finance minister or body have the authority to implement in Greece the reforms that all the others agreed on had to be done? So my question is this: what happens in a country? These are independent countries still. If they elect a parliament that just doesn't want to do what the Brussels consensus says. It was sort of what we had, and then Mr. Tsipras changed his mind along the way. But you could see in the future, I assume, that they don't change their mind. Is that the time when you then force them out, even if they want to stay in? That's my point. It's easy with Scotland. If they voted as they want to leave, it's kind of easy, I assume. But what about the one where you want to stay, but you don't want to do what everybody else thinks is right?
And perhaps let me add to this. I mean, I asked basically a very similar question to State Secretary Jens Spahn earlier today, and asked him, well, what if a Eurozone Parliament gave the legitimacy to the kind of decisions that have been taken in Greece? And his answer was found quite straightforward. Basically, he said this wouldn't be more popular than it would be in the case of the decision, the way they were taken now in the Eurogroup. So of course, you can say they're legitimate, but the tension will remain, I think, with the national level.
First, the answer is in your first question that we are not talking only about Greece, or mostly about Greece. The problem is to change the Eurogroup, which is today a body discussing mostly on programs and program countries, into a body which is capable of defining a European public policy in favor of growth and jobs. I would like us to have other discussions which look like what can we do for the sake, for the benefit of our citizens? What kind of common economic policy can we define? Not only addressing crises or programs. And there your first remark was very right. But the case of Greece also raises your own question. Who would be this finance minister in my view? It would not be a Eurozone Tsar. It would be, in my view, somebody who has the double hatting of chairing the Eurogroup while being a member of the Commission, as in a relaxed council. Federica Mogherini is a vice president of the Commission and chairs the relaxed council. And of course, this minister would act under the control of the Eurogroup, where the decision-making should remain quite the same, but with the huge difference that there is a permanent chair, and that the chair has the capacity to express a general interest. And then it would also mean that there would be a double source of legitimacy. Of course, the legitimacy of the European Parliament that should be or would have to be reinforced, but of course, on the governments, the legitimacy of national government parliaments would be kept. So I'm not saying that this minister would be a substitute to everything that exists, but that it would be a more precise, more legitimate and stronger leadership for the Eurogroup. What happens when a country is not agreeing to a program? Then we have no other way than to try to find another consensus. Because let's be clear, I'm deeply European, and I'm a federalist personally. But I think that when we are 28 in the EU, or 19 in the Eurozone, federalism cannot be defined as it was in the past. And we absolutely need to respect national sovereignties. It would be vain to have that kind of project which ignores the national sovereignties. What I mean is not that we should weaken the national sovereignties, but we should reinforce the European general interest and its personification.
Perhaps just before I come to Jeromin, I mean, you mentioned that this minister would kind of have an agenda-setting role. Should he also not have some sort of a voting role? I mean, I was thinking more of a system that would resemble a bit the central banking system, where Mario Draghi is not just the president of the national central bank governors, but he also is someone who has voting rights and takes actual decisions, so as to have some representation of the center with voting rights. I mean, that would be, of course, a much farther going reform, but it would strengthen the federal interest.
Probably, but frankly, I didn't think about that. So I won't elaborate on one point or improvise on one point. I didn't elaborate too much.
Yes, German Zettelmeier, German Ministry for Economic Affairs. So first of all, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much. So I have two questions. One is whether you could elaborate a bit on how you would imagine a euro area budget. So, you know, what kinds of spending or revenue responsibilities might it have, and how would spending responsibilities be differentiated from those that remain at the national level, which I think is quite a tricky. Of course, you know, there's some potential for free riding there. That's my first question. Then my second question is, so there are two stories on how EMU reform could prevent something like the Greek crisis this summer. One is, in a sense, the Maastricht philosophy, which is let's create, a set of incentives, rules, institutions that make it difficult and not impossible for a country to box itself into a situation where it would be, effectively at the brink of exit. I'm sure that EMU reform can do something in this respect. But there's another approach, which would be to say, let's create a mechanism where no matter how badly a country has boxed itself into a problem, everyone understands that this problem will not be resolved through Euro exit. And I think the key to that, just as a matter of logic, would be to guarantee liquidity support of a Euro member country's banking system, no matter what, say, fiscal policy does or the government does, which probably would require, some mechanism to establish international control of that banking system in a crisis. So, I haven't seen. I'm just following a sort of a train of thought. I have not seen this discussed much. I mean, the Five President report maybe doesn't have this discussion because it was actually issued before the crisis got really, really, really bad in the summer. But I'm wondering whether you think of there's any sort of type of reform that could make the euro truly irreversible. I mean, not just legally irreversible, but just avoid a situation where the ECB has to decide to cut off ELA, which happened in the summer, and it might happen again, conceivably.
First, thank you for the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs to welcome us here, and my warm greetings to Sigmar Gabriel. We'll start with the second point you mentioned, that could be a debate inside the German government, maybe, if I see what are the positions of the finance minister on one hand and the economic affairs minister on the other hand. But the two issues you raised are issues on which I'm open at the time, and I think that we need to elaborate a lot. Again, let's not improvise too much. On the second point, I see the interest of your proposal, which would be to say that Brexit has to be avoided at almost any price, and that we must have a definite single currency, which is the euro. The problem with the last 10 months is that people felt for the first time that the even existence or integrity of the euro was in question, and that I think was something not satisfying, and we must understand that and avoid that. That's your proposal. But other people, maybe even in Germany, could tell you then, well, okay, but those countries must also be responsible for their own failures or mistakes. And so we need to find the right balance between that, because then you could be accused of advocating for a union of transfer without any kind of limit, and this also could create public debate. So I think that both arguments should be discussed and balanced. Personally, I was not at ease with the idea of a Brexit. The Commission's position since the beginning was that no, Brexit had to be avoided, and that there has to be a clear mechanism. But this mechanism has also the necessity to make the country which made no reform, which cheated on its account, responsible. And the mechanism must also lead to the fact that in the end, the program must be conditional to prior actions, to strong reforms, because we need to have huge changes, for example, in Greece. Greece must have a tax administration which is the level of what expected, must have a state which is equal to the reputation of the democracy in Greece, etc., etc. You must have a pension reform, you must have a labor market reform. So I think that we must try to combine both. On what the budget should be, the financial capacity should be, there the debates are, I would say, fully opened. As well on what should it be made for. In my proposal as finance minister, I proposed I would say, a minimum insurance scheme against unemployment. And that was the basis. But some other advocate for a minimal capacity for investment or for stabilization. And I think that there we must have a lot of economic work about that. You're doing that. In France, other bodies are doing that too. But it would be very useful that we have that debate on the principle of a budget. Same for the resources. And then we come to a broader discussion. What should be the own resources of the budget of the EU first? And then what kind of resources can be thought for the euro area budget of financial capacity? And there I would risk that some new resources could be created that are linked to the production of what I call public goods. And I think about the FTT, that hopefully can be created with the support of the German government we're discussing in the framework of the reinforced cooperation, or what we could do with CCCTB in the years to come, common consolidated tax base for cooperation.
Okay, let me see whether there are further questions also in the back, and I will collect. I think there's one here in front, and is there any in the back? So then you are the last.
Thank you. Noah Barkin from Reuters. Because I'm a journalist, I have to ask about the latest crisis, which is neither Greece nor the refugees, although that's obviously going to be with us for a long time, but certainly in Germany, the Volkswagen crisis. And my question, you talked in your remarks about German influence in the European Parliament in Brussels. Does this crisis, in your view, have is it possible that this crisis may undermine Germany's credibility, influence in Brussels? This is one of Germany's major companies not sticking to the rules that during the Greece crisis, Germany talked about being very important. Can you tell us how you view the impact of this Volkswagen crisis on German influence in Brussels?
Of course, it's a very important crisis which causes damages to the image of the company itself and which raises questions about broader issues. But no, it does not limit at all German influence in Brussels. And I'm certain that Volkswagen has the capacity to overcome this crisis. And there, I think the key is transparency. What people want now is to know first exactly what happened, and second, that how it cannot happen again. And that is why the Commission is asking for inquiries, as well national or international, are asking for cooperation with the American authorities, cooperation with national authorities, so that we all as citizens can know what happened, and again, how it can be sure that it won't happen again. And the Commission also is guardian des traités, has to guarantee that the standards of the emissions, which are of high quality, that are asked by the European Union, are ensured. So, again, let's be quite cool-minded about that. No, it's not something which is irreversible, but transparency there is the key. Cooperation with national authorities, cooperation with the American authorities and cooperation with the Commission, and the Commission there wants to be an element of stability.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner. It was great to have you, and we had
Thank
a
you.
great discussion. Thank you so much.
Merci.